Hello, my name is Samantha Peter, and this is my narrated PowerPoint for Assignment 1.1 on how aspects of the grammar translation method and the silent way influenced my language learning experiences. And so, this little comic right here on the right, I just thought it would be fun to include because it reminded me of how grammar rules are focused on are part of the main focus of the grammar translation method. So yeah, it's just a little joke about commas. Okay, so I'm going to start by talking about the grammar translation method and how I experience specific aspects of this teaching method in my language learning. So first of all, I'm going to focus on my experiences learning Korean and Spanish. So I learned Korean for just one semester, and then I learned Spanish for about 5 years, both in a classroom environment. And so when I was learning both of these languages, learning how to conjugate verbs and learning various grammar rules was a huge part of both of these classes. And I connected this to the grammar translation method because I remember doing a lot of fill in the blank type exercises to practice verb conjugation and also different grammar rules. And I know that's common with the grammar translation method from the readings and the materials from the module. So that's what this first graphic here is representing on the right with the este o esta, esto, eso. These are the demonstrative pronouns in Spanish. And I remember in particular using these pronouns in grammar exercises and trying to learn them in class, but I never really understood them all the way. And then this other graphic in the corner, that's just conjugations for the verb to eat in Korean, which is 먹다. So for the present, you would say 먹어요. For the past, you would say 먹었어요. And then for the future, you would say 먹을 거예요. And then the second aspect I want to touch on is the way my language classes used reading and comprehension questions extensively. I felt like this was related to the grammar translation method because it was a technique used in one of the module videos and also referenced in the textbook. So those are two things that were a major part of my experience. Okay, so now we'll move on to how the grammar translation method worked for me in terms of my age and interest. So to start with age, I will say that the exercises we did, the grammar exercises in particular, were definitely easy to comprehend at all ages that I did them. This little graphic here is supposed to signify how I learn language from middle school through high school and also in college. So in all of those age groups, I I found the activities were appropriate in that they were pretty straightforward. And honestly, they did feel a little bit effective when I first started taking foreign language in the 7th grade for Spanish. However, over the years, just doing those same verb conjugation and grammar work exercises, it just got pretty old pretty quickly. And especially because I didn't feel like I was improving very much as I got older, even after doing all those exercises, I felt like it wasn't that effective. And then in terms of interest, I do remember feeling interested at times when like particular reading passages were funny or culturally relevant to me in some way. but those moments were a little few and far between. And that's kind of what I was trying to illustrate with this graphic here. The peaks on the red line are supposed to be like my interest peaking. And if I could adjust the graphic, I would say that these like flat lines should be longer to demonstrate how few and far between um, my interest was peaked with this method. And unfortunately, a lot of the topics and work we did with grammar rules and conjugation just felt irrelevant to my learning process, I guess, especially after the years of it not really helping me to improve. And then they also were just plain and engaging a lot of the time. So now we'll move on to how effectively the grammar translation method improved my proficiency levels and how much I retained the language thanks to this teaching method. So, to start with proficiency, for both languages, I would say I did improve temporarily in my proficiency. I put that graphic there of like a nice report card with A pluses to signify that I did do well in my language classes grade wise. And so that technically does prove that like I learned enough to pass a class over like the course of a semester or a school year. However, I will say I didn't really feel like my proficiency was truly improving. It felt more like I was memorizing rules and words for like an assignment or a quiz or some kind of presentation. And then by the end of the week or even the end of the day, I was forgetting most of it. And especially by the end of the semester or the year, or even by the next semester. And then moving on to my retention today. That little monkey there is supposed to represent my lack of ability to retain a lot of what I learned, like I just said, through the techniques drawing from the grammar translation method. In Spanish class, I remember even though we learned a lot of rules and how to conjugate into many different tenses, like the past, the future, the past participle, like a ton of different tenses, um, I can still only basically use the present tense today. And I feel like that's just kind of disappointing for me personally after 5 years. And then in Korean, I do remember a lot of the grammar concepts as ideas, but I don't remember how to use them, unfortunately. And so I'd conclude from all that basically my grades don't accurately reflect how well I learned the foreign languages, especially through the grammar translation method. Um, and overall, I didn't find how the grammar translation method was used in my experiences to be very effective for my learning. So now moving on to the silent way, I want to start by saying that I honestly don't think I really experienced being taught with this method. Um, when I watched a module video about this method and read the textbook chapter on it, I tried hard to think of an instance when I was taught this way, and I honestly just couldn't think of one. So, in lieu of that, I decided to take aspects of the silent way method that I read in a textbook and try to connect those to my experiences. So, to start, I picked cooperative peer correction as one of my experiences. This was noted as an aspect of the silent way, and in my experience, this looked like switching papers with fellow classmates and getting feedback from peers prior to turning in assignments for grading. So we were trying to help out each other before we actually had to turn in our work for a grade. And then the next aspect I related to was structured feedback as a part of the silent way teaching method. So for me, I related this to the way some of my language teachers asked for our opinions on what we enjoyed from a lesson and what topics we wanted particular assignments to focus on. And then finally, I wanted to mention this activity I did in high school in a Spanish class during my junior year called Charlas, where we had to come up to the room, to the front of the room, and speak to the class for about 2 or 3 minutes about a random topic during which our teacher was silent and didn't really correct us, which is the part that I found similar to the silent way teaching method. So now let's move on to how effective these methods were for my age and interest. So to start with the cooperative peer correction method, I did not find it very effective when I was learning language in the 7th grade because my classmates and I weren't very motivated to give good feedback or even really knew how to give good feedback, I think. So personally, I remember not wanting to make other students feel bad by changing their work, and I think that definitely affected how effective this particular method was. However, in college, I will say I remember getting some better feedback when I used this method in language class. And I remember that to the older, I attribute that to the older age group and just like a more mature mindset around giving feedback to others. Like I didn't feel bad about critiquing somebody's work. Like it was to help them rather than to criticize them. And then in terms of structured feedback, I would also say that I found it helpful. I found um, I found that helpful at all ages because it just allowed us as students to give our opinion on what we were being taught. But this method is definitely really reliant on having teachers who take that feedback seriously and incorporate that into future lessons or future assignments. And then finally, for the Charlas activity, I remember being about 15 or 16 when I had to do that. And I feel like it was not very effective at that age because if you were someone like me who felt a little inferior to begin with, just being a Mexican in a Spanish class who wasn't already fluent in Spanish, I remember just feeling embarrassed and stressed about that activity, unfortunately. So now moving on to the effectiveness of these methods on my interests, I will start with the cooperative peer correction method again. So for me, I did find this technique interesting in that it was a nice change in the routine of the typical students listening to the teacher lecture kind of lesson. I remember we got to talk to our classmates, so that was a bit more engaging for me in my experience, just having that opportunity. Um, for the structured feedback method, though, I do remember finding it interesting because we got to talk about what we liked or didn't like. Like I put there on the slide, complaining is engaging, especially in my classrooms because I feel like our opinions weren't often asked for. And so when we did get the chance, it was kind of exciting and um, I think it gave us hope that maybe the lessons would improve if we could give our input. And then finally, to touch on the charlas, I will say, in terms of interest, I do think the concept was interesting because it seemed like a plausible way to improve my speaking skills. But the reality of the situation was a bit different. And I think for me, at the age that I was at, it was a bit too intense of an activity for me to get anything out of it. Okay, now we're going to move on to how effectively these methods derived from the silent way improved my proficiency levels and my retention to the present day. So, starting with the cooperative peer correction method again, my proficiency levels unfortunately weren't very affected by this method, given that, as I mentioned earlier, I didn't receive much helpful feedback over the years. I will say I remember a few times in college when I received surprisingly good feedback, which I did mention earlier, I believe. So perhaps those experiences were beneficial to my language proficiency in some small way that I can't remember, but since I don't remember specifically any feedback that really changed how I thought about language, I'm going to leave that at like an unremarkable or unclear impact on my proficiency. And then regarding structured feedback, I would say this method definitely had the potential to improve my proficiency as long as my teacher incorporated um, my feedback and the feedback of my fellow classmates. I also do remember feeling more engaged in lessons that incorporated topics we recommended as a class. So I would say that was effective, at least subconsciously, on my proficiency. And then for the charlas, I would say that it's possible that my speaking proficiency improved in that after I went through the charla experience, I may have gained more confidence in speaking. But because I've practiced my speaking a lot with relatives over the years, I find it hard to pinpoint if the charlas were the cause of my speaking improvement or not. And then finally, to touch on my retention today as a result of these methods. To start, I will say that since I don't remember much of the actual peer corrections I received from my peers, I'm going to have to say this method was fairly unremarkable on improving my retention of language to today. In terms of my retention due to teachers incorporating structured feedback, I would have to say that this method probably would have improved my retention because me and my classmates' feedback would have made the lessons a bit more engaging for us. Unfortunately, I can't remember a specific case of this, but this is what I'm leaning towards. And then finally, in terms of the charlas, I would say the impact of this activity on my retention is unclear, especially because I don't remember receiving much feedback from my teacher because she was silent during our talking time. And I don't remember her giving much feedback after either. It's hard to say that this activity helped me retain any useful information. And with that, I will conclude my presentation on how my language learning experiences were influenced by the grammar translation method and the silent way. Thank you for listening.